Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
The Lawrence Massacre, also known as Quantrill's Raid, which was an attack by Quantrill's Raiders, which was a Confederate guerrilla group led by William Quantrill on the Unionist town of Lawrence, Kansas. I said it was Missouri earlier. Sorry, guys. Killing around 150 unarmed men and boys.
Damn.
By 1863, Kansas had long been the center of strife and warfare over the admission of slave states versus free. In the summer of 1856, the first sacking of Lawrence sparked a guerrilla war in Kansas that lasted for years.
Damn.
John Brown might be the best known participant in the violence of the late 50s. Participated on the abolitionist or Jayhawker side, but numerous groups fought for each side during the Bleeding Kansas period.
Ooh-wee. Frickin' Kansans. By the beginning of the American Civil War, Lawrence was already a target for pro-slavery ire. Having been seen as an anti-slavery stronghold in the state, more importantly, a staging area for Unionists and Jayhawker insurgents into Missouri. Initially, the town and surrounding area were extremely vigilant and reacted strongly to rumors that enemy forces might be advancing on the very town that they are staying in. By the summer of 1863, none of the threats had materialized, just like climate change. So citizens' fear had declined, and the defense preparations were relaxed.
Okay, Lawrence was the headquarters for a band of Jayhawkers, sometimes called Red Legs.
Is that why the Jayhawks have red legs?
I didn't know they did. I thought they had yellow legs.
Is it yellow?
I'm pretty sure. It's a bird.
Yeah, but it might have red.
Oh, my red. No, it's
Is it
definitely
orange?
yellow. No red. Got red buckles and a red head. What is a Jayhawk?
A bird.
Is it a real bird?
Yeah,
Are you sure?
I think. They wouldn't just make a bird up, would they?
Yes.
Oh, it's a
A
mythical
bird with a fascinating history.
No shit.
Right. Yeah. It looks like a toucan almost.
Yeah.
Weird. So, yes, they would just make a bird up. They initiated a campaign in late March 1863 with the purported objective to eliminate civilian support for the Confederate guerrillas. In describing the activities of these soldiers, U.S. Army General Blunt, which is James Blunt, "You're beautiful," he stated a reign of terror was inaugurated, and no man's property was safe, nor was his life worth much if he opposed them in their schemes of plunder and robbery.
Oh, man.
Indeed, many Jayhawker leaders like Charles Doc Jennison, James Montgomery, and George Henry Hoyt terrorized western Missouri, angering both pro-slavery and anti-slavery civilians and politicians alike.
No shit.
The historian Robert Castell thus concludes that revenge was the primary motive of this massacre, followed by a desire to plunder.
That's crazy. The survivors confirmed the retaliatory nature of the attack on Lawrence. According to Castell, the universal testimony of all the ladies and others who talked with the butchers of the 21st is that these demons claimed they were here to revenge the wrongs done their families by our men. What the done to their families? Some of that. Is that these demons...
Well, this is a quote from somebody, so according to Castell, this is what he said.
That's what he said. He can't talk very much. Is that these demons claimed they were here to revenge the wrongs done their families by our men under Lane, Jennison, Anthony, and company. Charles Robinson,
Damn.
the first governor,
Nate.
first governor of Kansas, an eyewitness to the raid, also characterized the attack as an
Why
attack.
wasn't he killed?
Right. He characterized it as an attack of vengeance. He says, before this raid, the entire border counties of Missouri had experienced more terrible outrages than ever the Quantrill raid at Lawrence. There was no burning of feet and torture by hanging in Lawrence as there was in Missouri. Neither were women and children outraged.
I don't know what any of that means. The way that's saying is there was no burning in Lawrence as there was in Missouri, so it wasn't that bad.
Or it was just as bad.
Robinson explained that Quantrill targeted Lawrence because Jayhawkers had attacked Missouri as soon as war broke out, and Lawrence was headquarters for the thieves and their plunder. Quantrill said his motivation for the attack was to plunder and destroy the town in retaliation for Osceola.
Oh.
That was a reference to the Union's attack on Osceola, Missouri in September 1861, which I'm pretty sure we covered, led by Senator James H. Lane. Osceola was plundered, and 9 men were given a drumhead court-martialed trial and executed. What does that mean? As a court-martial held in the field to hear urgent damn, so they just went out to the field and like heard the case right away and hung him. I mean, that needs
that's a speedy trial.
That needs to be done to more people nowadays.
Collapse of the women's prison in Kansas City is also often believed to have inspired some to join in on the attack in a bid to put down the Missouri guerrilla raiders operating in Kansas. General Thomas Ewing Jr. issued in April of 1863 a General Order Number 10, which ordered the arrest of anyone giving aid or comfort to Confederate guerrillas. This meant chiefly women or girls who were relatives of the guerrillas as well. Ewing confined those arrested in makeshift prisons in Kansas City. The women were sequentially housed in 2 buildings, which were considered either too small or too unsanitary, before being moved to an empty property at 1425 Grand Boulevard.
Or street or road or whatever. This structure was part of the estate of the deceased Robert S. Thomas, George Caleb Bingham's father-in-law, whoever that is. In 1861, Bingham and his family were living in the structure, but in early 1862, after being appointed treasurer of the state of Missouri, that's who he is, he and his family relocated to Jefferson City.
And he's left that big old huge house.
Right. Bingham had added a 3rd story to the existing structure to use as a studio, apparently. At least 10 women or girls, all under the age of 20, were incarcerated in the building when it collapsed on August 13, 1863, killing 4.
Jeez.
Charity McCorkle Kerr, Susan Crawford Van Dever, Armenia Crawford Selvey, and Josephine Anderson, who was the 15-year-old sister of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson.
Oh, shit.
You do not want to kill the sister of a guy named Bloody Bill.
No.
A few days later, Nanny Harris also died from her wounds.
Oh, shit. Survivors of the collapse included Jenny Anderson, she was crippled by the accident, Suzanne Ann Mundy Womax, Martha Maddie Mundy, Lucinda Lou Mundy Gray. Damn, they're all relatives.
Bunch of Mundys.
Elizabeth Harris, who later married to Deal, whoever Deal is, and Molly Grinstaff, Anderson's 13-year-old sister, who was shackled to a ball and chain inside the jail, suffered multiple injuries, including 2 broken legs.
See.
Rumors circulated, later promulgated by Bingham, who had held a personal grudge against Ewing and who would seek financial compensation for the loss of the building. The rumors were that the guards undermined the structure to cause its collapse. 1995 study of the events and affidavits surrounding the collapse concludes this is the least plausible of the theories.
Oh, sure, 100 and something years later.
Like they know.
Instead, testimony indicated that alterations to the first floor of the adjoining Cockrell structure for use as a barracks caused the common wall to buckle. The weight of the 3rd story on the former Bingham residence contributed to the resultant collapse.
I would say so.
Even before the collapse of the jail, the arrest and planned deportation of the girls had enraged Quantrill's guerrillas. George Todd left a note for General Ewing threatening to burn Kansas City unless the girls were freed. While Quantrill's raid on Lawrence was planned before the collapse of the jail, the deaths didn't help at all, because it undoubtedly added to their thirst for revenge and bloodlust during the raid.
Well, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Gee, they don't care. They're just moiting. Man, the attack was a product of careful planning. Quantrill had gained the confidence of many of the leaders of the independent bushwhacker groups and chose the day and time of the attack well in advance. Different Missouri rider groups approached Lawrence from the east in several independent columns. They converged with well-timed precision in the final miles. Man, these guys should be part of the actual army. Shit. They converged with well-timed precision in the final miles before Lawrence during the pre-dawn hours of the chosen day. Many of the men had been riding for over 24 hours to make the rendezvous and had lashed themselves to their saddles to keep riding if they fell asleep.
Nice.
Almost all were armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers.
Jeez. Henry Thompson, a black servant from Hesper, attempted to run on foot to Lawrence to warn the town of hundreds of raiders making their way towards Lawrence. Thompson made it as far as Eudora, Kansas, before stopping from exhaustion. An unidentified man riding a chaise nearby rode by to ask Thompson if he needed help. Thompson said, "Well, yes, sir, I do." He had run from Hesper, he said, and needed to warn Lawrence. While Thompson and the man on the chase were able to gather some Eudorians to ride into Lawrence to warn the city to the west, none of them made it in time.
No, they did not. Around 450 guerrillas arrived in the outskirts of Lawrence shortly after 5 a.m.
Damn, they're acting like the damn police about to do all that. It is a raid, so.
A small squad was dispatched to the summit of Mount Orade to serve as lookouts, and the remainder rode into town. One of the first deaths was the pastor and lieutenant of the 2nd Kansas Colored Regiment, Samuel S. Snyder. who was outside milking his cows when he was shot by the passing raiders, who were making their way into town at that very moment. Snyder's death was witnessed by his longtime friend, Reverend Hugh Fisher. Their initial focus was the Eldridge House, a large brick hotel in the heart of Lawrence. After gaining control of the building, which then served as Quantrill's headquarters during the raid, Quantrill's force broke into smaller groups that fanned out throughout the very town.
Over 4 hours, the raiders pillaged and burned a quarter of the buildings in Lawrence, including all but 2 businesses. They looted most of the banks and stores in town and killed over 150 people, all of them men and boys. According to an 1897 account, among the dead were 18 of the 23 unmustered army recruits. By 9 a.m., the raiders were on their way out of town, evading the few units that came in pursuit, and eventually splitting up to avoid Union pursuit of a unified column into Missouri. Some families attempted to make the run towards Mount Oread in a last-ditch flight for safety.
Oh, man, this is crazy. The raid was less of a battle and more of a mass execution.
Clearly.
2 weeks before the attack, a Lawrence newspaper had boasted, "Lawrence is ready for any emergency, over 500 fighting men, every one who would like to see Quantrill's raiders." Yeah, would they? However, a squad of soldiers temporarily stationed in Lawrence had returned to Fort Leavenworth, and due to the surprise, swiftness, and fury of the initial assault, the local militia was unable to assemble any amount of defense.
Wow.
Most of those Quantrill and his raiders were not carrying any weapons. Before the Lawrence Massacre, a previous attack on Lawrence, the sacking of Lawrence, saw the pro-slavery attackers, led by Samuel Jones, a pro-slavery Missourian, who served as the sheriff of Douglas County, demanding that the citizens of Lawrence give up the firearms to the raiders.
Many citizens initially refused, but by the end of the sacking itself, many in Lawrence were left without a weapon of any sort, which, along with the swiftness of the Lawrence Massacre later on, saw Lawrence left defenseless against the attack. Because revenge was a principal motive for the attack, Quantrill's raiders entered Lawrence with lists of men to be killed and buildings to be burned.
Right.
Senator James H. Lane was at the top of this list. Lane was a military leader and chief political proponent of the Jayhawking raids that had cut a swath of death, plundering, and arson through western Missouri, which included the destruction of Osceola. Lane escaped death by racing through a cornfield in his nightshirt.
No shit, look at that. John Spear, who Lane had put into the newspaper business, was one of Lane's chief political backers and also on the list. Spear likewise escaped execution, but 2 of his sons were moited in the raid. One of Spear's sons may have been the same John Spear that appeared on a list of red legs previously issued by the Union Army. Spear's youngest son, 15-year-old Billy, may have been included on the death list, but Quantrill's men released him after he gave them a false name. Billy Spear later shot one of the raiders during their exit from Lawrence, causing one of the few casualties among Quantrill's command while in Lawrence. Charles Robinson, first governor of Kansas and a prominent abolitionist, may also have been on the list, although he was not moited. So clearly he wasn't on the list.
Right. This according to Richard Cordley, who was a minister in Lawrence and survivor of the attack. He says ex-Governor Charles Robinson was an object of special search among them. He was one of the men they particularly wanted. During the whole time they were in the town, he was in his large stone barn on the hillside. He had just gone to the barn to get his team to drive out into the country when he saw them come in and saw them make their first charge. He concluded to remain where he was. The barn overlooked the whole town, and he saw the affair from beginning to end. Gangs of raiders came by several times and looked at the barn and went around it, but looked so much like a fort they kept out of range. Right. Damn, this dude had a stone barn?
Right. Cordley was also on the list of men Quantrill wanted moited. In some of his writings, Quantrill later lamented that he did not kill Cordley, the abolition preacher. While many of the victims had been specifically...
He lamented? Does that mean he regrets it, pretty much?
Maybe. While many of the victims had been specifically targeted beforehand, executions were more indiscriminate among segments of the raiders.
I'm sure they were.
Particularly Todd's band that operated in the western part of Lawrence. The men and boys riding with Bloody Bill Anderson also accounted for a disproportionate number of the Lawrence dead. The raid devolved into extreme brutality. According to witnesses, the raiders moited a group of men and their sons who had surrendered under assurances of safety. They moited a father who was in a field with his son, shot a defenseless man who was lying sick in bed, killed an injured man who was being held by his pleading wife, and bound a pair of men and forced them into a burning building where they slowly burned to death.
Jeez.
Jeez, oh, Pete.
Another dramatic story was told in a letter written on September 7, 1863 by H.M. Simpson, whose entire family narrowly escaped death by hiding in a nearby cornfield as the massacre raged all around them. He says, "My father was very slow to get into the cornfield. He was so indignant at the ruffians that he was unwilling to retreat before them. My little children were in the field 3 hours. They seemed to know that if they cried, the noise would betray their parents' whereabouts, and so they kept as still as mice. The baby, even, was very hungry. He was very hungry, she or he, and I gave her an ear of raw green corn, which she ate ravenously.
Damn.
Ew. Many have characterized Quantrill's decision to kill young boys alongside adult men as particularly reprehensible aspect of that raid.
Right.
Well, obviously,
It's
dude.
ridiculous.
Stupid.
Bobby Martin is generally cited as being the youngest victim. Some histories of the raid state he could have been as young as 10 to 12 years old, while others state he was 14.
It doesn't matter.
Most accounts state that he was wearing a Union soldier uniform or clothing made from his father's uniform. Some state he was carrying a musket and cartridges. For perspective on the age of the participants in the conflict, it has been estimated that about 800,000 Union soldiers were 17 years of age or younger. Damn. With about 100,000 of those being 15 or younger.
What's that book?
Wow.
What's that book? I'm sure you read it in school, because I had to. And it was like a requirement about the kid. He's like 14, 13, and he runs away from home and joins the war. You don't remember? And then he ends up in like the mountains in like the Blue Ridge Mountains at some lady's house, and because he ran away from the war and shit like that. He was a drummer boy. I think it was the drummer boy or something like that.
Probably.
Yeah, it was a good book though. Yeah, but how many of them? Yeah, because usually they were drummer boys or like the band or something like that.
Right.
13, 14 years old. It's ridiculous.
Most of Qauntrill's guerrilla fighters were also teenagers. One of the youngest was Riley Crawford, who was 13 years old when he was taken by his mother to Quantrill after her husband was shot and her home burned by Union soldiers.
Oh, she was like, "You better raise this boy right like he's your own."
Take him.
Once the Confederates withdrew to the southeast, Lane led a small group of survivors of the massacre in pursuit of the men and was joined by a force of about 200 U.S. Army cavalrymen commanded by Major Preston Plum. They overtook the raiders south of the town of Brooklyn, Kansas, which we'll have coming up. But it was the Lawrence Massacre was one of the bloodiest events in the history of Kansas, I bet. The Plymouth Congregational Church in Lawrence survived the attack, but a number of its members were killed and records destroyed. Imagine that. Little-ass town, 150 people are just laying dead in the streets. Dude.
Correct.
Cordley, the pastor at Plymouth, said that his congregation a few days after the attack, "My friends, Lawrence may seem dead, but she will rise again in a more glorious resurrection. Our ranks have been thinned by death, but let us close up, and hold the ground of Kansas. The conflict may not be ended, but the victory must be ours. We may perish, but the principles for which we contend will live."
Oh, good for you, bud. A day after attack, some of the surviving citizens of Lawrence lynched a member of Quantrill's raiders who was caught in the town.
This dude's got some fucking nuts, doesn't he?
Right. August 25th, General Ewing authorized General Order Number 11, not to be confused with Grant's infamous General Order of the same name. He evicting thousands of Missourians in 4 counties from their homes near the Kansas border.
Oh, damn.
Virtually everything in these counties was then systematically burned to the ground.
Damn.
The action was carried out by the infamous Jayhawker Charles Doc Jennison. Jennison's raids into Missouri were thorough and indiscriminate.
How many people did he massacre that they're not saying here?
Exactly. They left 5 counties in western Missouri wasted, save for the standing brick chimneys of the 2-story period houses, which are still called Jennison's monuments in those parts.
I wonder if they're still there.
I'm sure some of them are.
George Miller, a Missouri abolitionist and preacher, described the role of the Lawrence Massacre in the region's descent into the horror of total war on the civilian populations of both eastern Kansas and western Missouri. Viewed in any light, the Lawrence Raid will continue to be held as the most infamous event of the uncivil war, he says. The work of destruction did not stop in Kansas. The cowardly criminality of the spiteful reciprocity lay in the fact that each party knew but did not care that the consequences of their violent acts would fall most heavily upon their own helpless friends. Jennison in 1861 rushed into Missouri when there was no one to resist, and robbed and killed and sneaked away with his spoils, and left the Union people of Missouri to bear the vengeance of his crimes. Quantrill in 1863 rushed into Lawrence when there was no danger, and killed and robbed and sneaked off with his spoils, leaving helpless women and children of his own side to bear the dreadful vengeance invoked by that raid. Right. So the Lawrence Raid was followed by swift and cruel retribution, falling, as usual in this border warfare, upon the innocent and helpless rather than the guilty ones. Quantrill left Kansas with the loss of 1 man. The Kansas troops followed him at a respectful distance and visited dire vengeance on all western Missouri. Unarmed old men and boys were accused and shot down. Oh, see, okay. Yeah. And homes with their now meager comforts were burned, and helpless women and children turned out with no provision for their approaching winter. The numbers of those killed was never reported, as they were scattered all over western Missouri.
I guarantee you there was hundreds. Sickening. After the attack, Quantrill led his men south to Texas for the winter. By the next year, the Raiders had disintegrated as a unified force and could not achieve similar successes. Quantrill died of wounds he received in Kentucky in 1865, with only a few staunch supporters left. Among those who remained by his side were Frank James and his younger brother Jesse.
Yeah, what did I say?
After Quantrill's attack, the U.S. Army erected several military posts on Mount Oriad, of which a few were named Camp Ewing, Camp Lookout, and Fort Ulysses.
Okay.
They did this to keep guard over the rebuilt city. No further attacks were made on Lawrence, and these installations were eventually abandoned and dismantled after the war.
The Lawrence Massacre is a central episode in Wildwood, boys, a biographical novel about Bloody Bill Anderson by James Carlos Blake. Battle is also depicted in the Steven Spielberg produced 2005 miniseries Into the West, with Ang Lee and in Ang Lee's 1999 film Ride with the Devil, as well as the Audie Murphy Western Kansas Raiders in 1950. 1940 film Dark Command, based on a novel of the same name, as a fictionalized events of the account of the events and much more of the classic B-movie Western style. The film bore no resemblance to the events of history. 1979 TV movie The Legend of the Golden Gun was about chasing down Quantrill and had some fiction in about Custer. Okay.
Whatever. There's a section in Charles Portis's 1968 book, The True Grit, in which the characters Marshal Rooster Cogburn and Texas Ranger LaBeouf argue about Quantrill. LaBeouf calls him a murderer. Cogburn, who rode with Quantrill, calls him a patriot.
Oh, damn.
LaBeouf ends the argument after Cogburn refers to Captain Quantrill, ridiculing the title Captain of What? The conversation later appeared in 1969 and 2010 films.
2010 film with Beau Bridges as a fantastic masterpiece, by the way.
69 one was better.
That's all right.
In Telltale's 2012 video game The Walking Dead, Quantrill's raid is mentioned as two characters, Lee and Omid, bond over Civil War history. Whatever.
Okay.
In Weekend Warriors, the 6th episode of Season 1 of Psych, originally aired August 11, 2006, a reenactment of the battle in Lawrence, Kansas, where Quantrill is moited, is the scene for the murder that is the focus of the episode.
Okay.
1968 movie Bandolero references this event as well.
All right, got a lot of references. Okay.